For months, royal watchers noticed something unusual about Prince Louis. He was there, and then suddenly, he wasn't. While William and Catherine continued to carry out their public duties, questions surrounding their youngest son began to grow. Why had Louis been kept away from the public eye? Was there a simple reason behind his absence, or was something far more personal taking place away from the cameras? Then came the moment that changed the conversation completely. William and Catherine were reportedly left deeply emotional as the reason behind Louis's absence came into focus. And what made the situation so difficult was not simply what had happened to Louis, but why his parents had chosen to keep so much of it private. For a family whose every public appearance is watched around the world, silence can speak louder than words. And in this case, that silence raised one question above all others. What were William and Catherine trying to protect Louis from? The answer is more complicated than many royal watchers expected, and once you understand what was happening behind the scenes, those earlier appearances begin to look very different. Was this simply another attempt by William and Catherine to protect their children from the relentless attention that has followed the royal family for generations? Or had something happened inside the family that the public had not been told about? The claims surrounding the situation have generated fresh speculation.
Well, Prince Louis' vision has emerged of him absolutely beaming.
But the larger story is not really about one missing royal appearance. It is about a decision Prince William made years ago, a decision shaped by his own childhood. A decision intended to give his children something he never had himself: privacy. And yet, in a painful twist, the very protection designed to shield Louis may have created a new problem. Because sometimes, when children are given no explanation, they create their own. And what Louis may have believed about himself is at the heart of this extraordinary story. For years, William and Catherine have followed a remarkably consistent approach to raising their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis have appeared in public, but only selectively. They have not been exposed to the cameras in the way William and Harry were when they were young. There have been appearances at Christmas in Sandringham, appearances on the Buckingham Palace balcony during major celebrations, selected sporting occasions, and carefully chosen family photographs. Even those photographs have often been taken by Catherine herself. The principle was simple. If the family could control when the children were photographed, and when those photographs were released, they could protect some part of their private lives from the machinery of the media. For almost a decade, that approach worked remarkably well. George reached the age of 9 after only a relatively small number of public appearances. Charlotte grew up without the kind of relentless exposure that had followed previous generations. There were no constant long-distance photographs of the children crying, falling over, having difficult days, or simply behaving like ordinary children. Those moments remained private, and that was precisely what William wanted. Because William understood something that few people could understand as personally as he did. He knew what it meant to grow up under a camera lens. He knew what it meant for the public to believe it had a right to see every part of a royal child's life. And his memories went back to one of the most painful days imaginable, September 1997. William was only 15 when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. The world watched. Millions watched. And in the years that followed, Diana's private life continued to be exposed. Letters became public. Her handwriting was examined. Her clothing was displayed and sold. Recordings of her voice, never intended for a global audience, became part of the public story surrounding her. For a teenage William, the lesson was impossible to miss. Royal privacy could disappear almost instantly. And once it disappeared, it could never truly be recovered. So when William eventually became a father, he chose a different path. He would not allow George, Charlotte, and Louis to become constant subjects of public curiosity. He would decide when they appeared. He would decide how much they were exposed to. And most importantly, he would try to give them something he had been denied: a childhood that felt as normal as possible. That policy became part of the family's life. But then, in 2024, the circumstances surrounding the family became more difficult. King Charles began cancer treatment. William took on additional royal responsibilities. At the same time, Catherine was dealing with her own health while trying to maintain a sense of normality for her children. The pressure surrounding the family increased, and somewhere inside that pressure, the carefully constructed balance began to change. Louis, the youngest of the three children, received the greatest level of protection. George already had a clearly understood future. He was the future king. Charlotte had gradually become more comfortable with public appearances as she grew older. But Louis remained the child his parents had worked hardest to keep away from the spotlight. Then his public appearances became even less frequent. Events that had once appeared on the family calendar quietly disappeared. 2 occasions that Louis had attended in previous years went ahead without him. And eventually, people noticed. They started counting. How long had it been since anyone had seen him? Why had he not appeared? And why was there still no explanation? Whenever questions arose, the response attributed to the palace was brief. It was a matter of family privacy, nothing more. That answer may have been intended to close the discussion. Instead, it opened another one, because when people are told nothing, they begin filling the silence themselves. And that was the first great irony of the story. The policy created to prevent speculation was beginning to encourage it. Inside the household, however, the thinking was reportedly very different. William believed his children had a right to privacy. Senior advisors reportedly warned that prolonged silence could create an entirely different problem. They understood something about public life that families often learn the hard way. When a person suddenly disappears from a public schedule, people notice. Royal engagements are not casual diary entries. They are planned, recorded, and publicly observed. A change becomes visible. A missing appearance becomes part of the record. And if there is no explanation, the unanswered question can become more powerful than any official statement. The advisors were reportedly not asking William to reveal private details about his son. They wanted only a simple explanation, something broad enough to protect the family's privacy, but clear enough to stop speculation from growing. William, however, remained firm. He had spent decades watching the consequences of public scrutiny. He knew exactly how quickly curiosity could turn into intrusion, and he believed that if keeping Louis away from the spotlight protected his son, then the absence of 1 or 2 royal appearances was a small price to pay. From a parent's perspective, the decision was understandable. But there was another side to the problem. Louis was not simply a name on a royal schedule. He was an 8-year-old child, and children do not always understand why adults make decisions for them. They notice patterns. They notice who leaves the house. They notice who stays behind. They notice when conversations suddenly stop. They notice when adults lower their voices. And they notice when everyone else appears to know something that they do not. That is where the story takes a much more emotional turn, because according to the claims surrounding this account, Louis began to wonder whether there was something wrong with him. Not whether he was ill, not whether he had done something wrong. Something much more painful. He may have begun to believe that his family was ashamed of him. Imagine being 8 years old and watching your older brother and sister leave for public occasions while you remain at home. Imagine seeing adults become quieter whenever your name is mentioned. Imagine being too young to understand the machinery of royal privacy, but old enough to understand that something has changed. A child given no explanation does not see the world as an adult does. A child searches for an explanation, and sometimes the explanation becomes painfully personal. But Louis was not the only child affected. George was 13. At that age, a child is old enough to recognize tension, but still too young to understand everything behind it. According to the account, George became quieter and more responsible. He seemed determined to remain calm and make things easier around the household. From the outside, he appeared to be coping, but inside the family, another child was noticing even more. Charlotte. At 11, she was old enough to see what adults thought they were hiding. She noticed doors closing. She noticed conversations changing when she entered a room. She noticed adults suddenly finding reasons to leave. Nobody had apparently sat her down and explained everything. So she began connecting the pieces herself. And instead of focusing on her own fears, she turned her attention toward Louis. She began leaving handwritten jokes beside his bed, again and again. Small things, simple things, but to an 8-year-old, they could mean everything. Charlotte had apparently noticed something that adults had overlooked. When Louis laughed, he seemed happier. He seemed more like himself, so she tried to give him reasons to laugh. It was a quiet act of love from one child to another. But then came the question that revealed how much she had already understood. After reportedly overhearing members of the household discussing the growing public attention surrounding the family, Charlotte asked whether strangers were worried about Louis. Then came an even more troubling question. Was Louis going to have to answer all of them? Think about what that means. An 11-year-old was thinking about the burden of public scrutiny, a burden she should never have needed to carry. But the adults had been trying so hard to protect the children from the outside world that they may have unintentionally left the children alone with their own fears. And while Charlotte was quietly trying to help her brother, Catherine was carrying fears of her own. She was attempting to keep family life as normal as possible while dealing with enormous personal pressure. According to the account, she spent time reassuring Charlotte that some things simply take time, but privately she was struggling. She was barely sleeping. She carried fears she did not want William to see, and William was doing something remarkably similar. He was hiding his own worries because he wanted to protect Catherine. Both were trying to protect each other, and neither realized that they had begun doing something dangerous. They had stopped speaking honestly about how they really felt. There were no dramatic arguments, no great confrontation. Instead, the strain appeared in quieter ways. Conversations became shorter. Feelings remained unspoken. Kindness became quieter. Two people living under the same roof were carrying separate burdens. And right in the middle of it all was their youngest son. Louis was too young to understand the institution surrounding him, but he was old enough to feel that something had changed. Anyone who has followed the family knows the public image of Louis as the lively youngest child. The child who struggles to sit completely still. The child who pulls funny faces. The child who asks questions. The child who can transform a formal occasion simply by behaving like a child. His playful expressions have repeatedly attracted attention, but that lively personality also made his sudden absence more noticeable. And then, one day, he simply stopped going to places. The house became quieter. Adults lowered their voices. The atmosphere changed, and little by little, even Louis began to feel it. The silence that had been designed to protect him was becoming something else, something he could feel, something he could not understand. Until eventually, according to the account, the tension reached a turning point. It happened after the children had gone to bed. There was no public ceremony, no press conference, no palace announcement, just a private conversation between William and Catherine, and what began as a discussion about what should happen next became something far more serious. Catherine had prepared a statement. Like so many royal statements, the official version had been carefully drafted. The communications team had prepared the language. Advisors had reviewed it. Every word was designed to avoid unnecessary controversy and reveal only what was considered appropriate. Catherine initially followed that prepared approach, but then she stopped. She looked at the pages, and instead of continuing to read, she placed them face down. She began speaking in her own words. That alone would have been extraordinary. Royal communications are carefully controlled for a reason. But according to the account, the moment became even more emotional when Catherine began talking about Louis. Her eyes filled with tears. She continued speaking anyway. She did not stop. She did not ask for a break. She spoke through the emotion, and that moment raises a question far more important than what appeared in the statement. What could have made someone so accustomed to discipline and restraint decide that the prepared words were no longer enough? The answer, according to the account, was sitting much closer to home. Catherine believed the official statement did not capture what the family had actually experienced. The palace version was safe. It was controlled. But to her, it did not sound real. It talked about the situation without describing the emotional reality behind it. It spoke carefully about privacy, but it did not explain what that privacy had begun to mean to an 8-year-old boy. And Catherine reportedly could no longer ignore that, because Louis had begun to believe that he was the problem. That was the heartbreaking consequence. The very strategy designed to protect him had potentially caused him to question his own worth. Catherine reportedly explained this to William. She told him that Louis had started believing he was being kept away because the family was ashamed of him. And suddenly, the argument was no longer about the media. It was no longer about palace strategy. It was about a little boy who did not understand why everyone else was allowed to leave while he stayed behind. William's reaction, according to the account, was emotional. He reminded Catherine of what happens once words become public. Once released, a statement can be copied, quoted, and discussed indefinitely. A sentence written today can be examined years later, and William knew exactly what that could mean for his son. But Catherine was no longer willing to accept silence as the answer. She pointed toward the official draft. What did these carefully chosen words actually say about the child at the center of the story? Where was Louis himself in all of this? Where was the little boy who laughed? Where was the child who brought energy into quiet rooms? Where was the 8-year-old who simply wanted to understand why his life had suddenly changed? Catherine reportedly believed those things had been lost beneath the polished language of the palace. And she was not the only one who had noticed the consequences. George had become more cautious. Charlotte had started whispering whenever Louis was mentioned. She had taken it upon herself to make him laugh. The children were responding to a situation the adults had hoped they would never have to understand, and that changed the conversation completely, because the question was no longer simply whether the family should explain Louis's absence. The question was whether protecting a child from public attention could itself become emotionally damaging if the child did not understand why. And then came the most difficult part. King Charles became involved. According to the account, the draft eventually reached the king after one of his regular briefings. Before reading it, he asked the others to leave. He sat alone. He read the pages. Then he read them again. Something in the wording had caught his attention. A line about a child confusing privacy with shame. Charles reportedly stopped. He removed his glasses, and for a moment, there was nothing more to say. Because Charles had grown up inside the very system now being questioned, the royal family has always been built around restraint, duty, discretion, silence, the idea that private pain should remain private, that emotions should be controlled, that the institution comes before the individual. Charles understood that world perhaps better than anyone, and according to the account, he recognized the danger of allowing the same lesson to be passed down without question. Then came the question that reportedly changed the discussion. Was the statement really going to help Louis? Or was it simply going to make the adults around him feel better? It was an uncomfortable question. But sometimes the most important questions are the ones nobody wants to hear. A family can believe it is protecting a child, but protection can become complicated when the child does not understand what is being protected from. And there was another detail that reportedly became decisive. The edited version of the statement had removed words attributed to Louis himself, words that expressed gratitude toward those who had supported him. They were apparently considered unnecessary. But according to the account, Charles saw them differently. Those words belonged to the child at the center of the story. Removing them might make the statement cleaner. It might make it safer, but it could also remove the one thing that made the message sound genuinely human. And according to someone described in the source as having witnessed the discussion, Charles refused to approve that edited version. The reasoning was striking. Protecting the monarchy could not come at the expense of the child the monarchy was supposed to serve. And suddenly, the entire situation looked different. What had begun as a decision about a few public appearances had become a much deeper question about royal childhood, privacy, family responsibility, and the cost of silence. For nearly 10 years, William and Catherine's approach had protected their children remarkably well. Compared with the childhoods experienced by William and Harry, George, Charlotte, and Louis had enjoyed an extraordinary degree of privacy. There were no constant photographs outside school gates, no endless public record of every ordinary childhood mistake, no expectation that every tear, every fall, and every difficult day should become public entertainment. William had succeeded in giving his children something he had never been able to enjoy himself. But even the most carefully designed protection has limits. And this may have been the point at which those limits became visible, because privacy is powerful, but children also need understanding. And when those two needs collide, even loving parents can find themselves facing an impossible decision. William wanted to protect Louis from the world. Catherine wanted Louis to understand that he was not the problem. Charlotte wanted her little brother to smile again. George wanted to help without creating more trouble. And Charles, according to the account, was forced to confront a question that had followed the royal family for generations. How much should children be expected to carry in silence simply because they were born into a royal family? That is what makes this story so much more complicated than a missing appearance. It is not simply about where Louis was. It is about what he may have believed while he was away. And that distinction changes everything. For William, the memories of Diana's death had made privacy feel like protection. For Catherine, watching her children struggle made silence feel increasingly difficult to justify. For Charlotte, the answer was simpler: make her brother laugh. For Louis, the answer may have been painfully simple too. He wanted to know why, and perhaps that is the most human part of the entire story. Behind the crowns, the titles, the ceremonies, and the carefully managed public appearances, there was still a family trying to protect a child. A father who had seen the consequences of relentless public scrutiny, a mother who could no longer hide her emotions behind prepared words, an older brother quietly becoming more responsible, an older sister leaving jokes beside her younger brother's bed, and an 8-year-old boy trying to understand why the rules seemed to have changed for him. The palace may have been able to control a schedule, it could control a photograph, it could control a statement, but it could not control what a child felt when nobody explained what was happening. And that may have been the lesson at the heart of the entire episode, because the most difficult secrets inside a family are not always the ones kept from the public. Sometimes they are the things adults believe children are too young to understand, until the child begins to understand them anyway, and by then, the silence can already have consequences. The story surrounding Prince Louis therefore leaves us with a much larger question. Was William wrong to protect his son so fiercely, or was he simply trying to spare Louis from the painful childhood he himself had endured? Was Catherine wrong to challenge the carefully prepared palace language, or did she recognize something that the official machinery could not? And was Charles defending royal tradition, or quietly acknowledging that tradition itself sometimes has to change? There may never be a complete public answer to every private detail. That is the nature of royal family life. Some conversations will remain behind closed doors. Some fears will never become public. Some decisions will only be understood years later. But one thing is clear from the story presented here. The absence of a young prince from a few royal occasions may have looked insignificant from the outside. Inside the family, it represented something much bigger, a struggle between privacy and explanation, between protection and openness, between the world William had experienced as a child and the childhood he wanted to create for his own children. And perhaps, above everything else, it was a reminder that even inside one of the world's most famous families, children still need the same thing children everywhere need. To know that they are loved, to know that they are not the problem, and to know that when the adults around them become quiet, it is not because there is something wrong with them. That may be why Catherine's emotional reaction mattered so much. It was not simply a departure from a prepared statement. It represented a mother deciding that, at least for one moment, the polished language of the institution was not enough. And perhaps that is the real story behind Prince Louis's absence.